certainly don't seem to have run out of steam discussing profit and purpose. I'm just going to open it up. If anybody's got a burning something that they want to say, then let me know. But first of all, I think I'm going to head over to table number 11. Thank you, Lisa. And ask Lisa Fernerhoff, who gets involved in technology and transformation at KPMG, to talk a little bit about the discussion you had.
Fantastic. We had a good discussion here. Mixture of organizations that are startups and non-startups. So part of the conversation was around the DNA of an organization. That in the startups, this whole idea of innovation and failing fast and failing is just part of the DNA. But then we explored that a little bit more. Had a conversation around how venture capital looks at investment in a portfolio, and could you do the same thing in an organization? You're going to make your money, and then the rest. And so could you look at your innovation in a similar way and get to a result that would encourage a different culture? A couple other things we had was 20% of the money is given to the stupid things, the things that you don't know whether they'll ever have a chance at it. You give it a chance for people to do something totally different. Is another way of trying to encourage innovation. Metrics, we had a bit of a discussion around metrics. There was some disagreement. Some said for innovation, how can you have a metric? If I put a metric on it, then they won't actually innovate. Others said, well, you could be a bit broader around that and instead say, what I want you to think about is, what's a business line that doesn't exist, and create something new that would give us a billion in revenues? What would that be? And you could have that kind of a metric. And the very last thing I would say is leadership. We kept on coming back to the topic of leadership. And around that is having clear conviction from the leaders around innovation and what you're trying to achieve, and being authentic, vulnerable. We talked about sharing where we failed. And that encourages a sense of belonging and safety so that people can fail and do well in their innovation.
Thanks, Lisa. It's really interesting because on our table we were discussing profit and purpose, and some of the same topics came up. Metrics, courage, conviction of the leaders, failing fast, all of those things came up in that discussion. Maybe I could turn to Chris Hurld on table 6, who Chris leads our regional business and private capital business. Chris.
Thanks, Mel. It was a fascinating discussion around this table. We were fortunate to have both chief executives and representatives of funders around it, so it gave that added perspective to the conversation. I don't think there was any disagreement around the point that purpose was hugely important and undoubtedly does outweigh profit over the long term. It's described as what makes a business three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional. But the debate quickly moved on to the fact that in business, as in life, events tend to get in the way of intentions, and particularly at those critical moments in a business's development, the focus on short-term return, short-term profitability can start to distract focus. So how do you maintain that focus? An acknowledgement that the CEO there becomes absolutely crucial. Their vision and leadership will maintain hopefully that focus, but also the importance of non-execs and the wider board. That moved us into quite an interesting discussion about corporate governance and fiduciary duty, and a sense that perhaps at those critical moments, the setup of company law and the setup of corporate governance will drive people to worry about the financials much more than anything else, because that's ultimately what gets you in trouble. Moving us on to a discussion about, what's the role for government and regulation in this space, and is it possible for them to change regulation in a way that makes purpose-driven companies more likely? I have to say some nervousness about that, as there was about the concept of widening employee representation on boards. We'd had positive and negative experiences of that around the table. So I think we then concluded with a conversation about long-term sustainability, a feeling that the best businesses to invest in the long term will be those that are purpose-led. And therefore, could we get to the investing community with this message? And ultimately, it's in their interests for the businesses they invest in to have purpose and clear direction. We're seeing more of a shift from public to private sources of capital. So the big fund managers, the big pension funds, perhaps they're the community that need to be engaged in this first.
Great. I'm conscious of time because I think Michael Gove may already have arrived. So I'll just wrap up by saying one thing, which is that it's very, very clear from what was said, and this is no pressure on the CEOs in the room, that the CEO is critical on whatever agenda item we're talking about here, whether it's profit and purpose or disruption. It requires courage, it requires vision, and it requires conviction on all these fronts. So I wish you all luck as CEOs, and I'll look forward to hearing from Michael Gove. Thank you very much.
Well, in a few moments, we're going to start our annual parade of the candidates for Prime Minister. But before I do that, I just want to take the temperature of the room again and ask and pose a few questions to you. So if you could reach for your phones, and we'll get the questions up. The first one, what should be the biggest priority in ensuring stability for Britain over the coming months? There was a runaway winner when we asked this question last year, and it'll be interesting to see if it's the same this time around. The runaway winner was the trade question last year, which took 85% of you last year. There's actually start to read it, it changes. So still, access to trade and financial markets remains the single most important. Transport, broadband, diverse leadership teams, investment in skills, or better harnessing of data, AI and robotics. On which note, I'd like to encourage you to use the digital playroom that we have over there with all sorts of crazy gizmos in. So when we release you from these sessions, I do encourage you to go there. Now, last year the investment was the largest single item, but there was an even spread of the others, and it's increasingly so this year, it appears. That's bigger, 44% last year, 62% this year. So investment and trade are the themes that are running through all of these questions. Let's move to the next question. A very simple one. Will the UK fall into a recession in the next 12 months? Last year, 15% of you didn't know, and I don't want that sort of, still about the same number don't know. Last year, there was a sense of optimism in the room. 59% thought no, and was slightly more evenly split, but, well, really no clear decision there at all. So it's like Parliament. Let's go to the next and final question. Are you actively planning for a no deal? I'll give you a clue. The answer is A. Oh dear, 17% of you. Well, most of you are, and it's going to be one of the topics we talk about now. Now, the last time that Rachel Sylvester interviewed somebody who was campaigning to be Prime Minister, that person, Andrea Leadsom, had to pull out 2 days later for the revelations that she made in that interview. So, although she might seem nice, Rachel wields a rapier. And on the receiving end of her rapier today, we're delighted to welcome Michael Gove. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel Sylvester and Michael Gove.
Michael, thanks so much for doing this.
Not at all, Rachel, not at all.
John McDonnell was here earlier, and as we all know, he's a Marxist. But what fascinates me is you used to have a picture of Lenin on your wall. And in fact, David Cameron used to say you were a Maoist because you were in favour of creative destruction. So are you really as much of a revolutionary as John McDonnell? If so, why on earth are you a Conservative?
No, I'm not a revolutionary. One of the reasons I had a picture of Lenin on my wall was that he was the person who first coined the phrase education, education, education. But I also had the posters of various other people on my wall when I was at the Department for Education, including Martin Luther King, Barack Obama,
Malcolm X,
and Malcolm
another
X.
revolutionary.
And one of the reasons for that is I thought that education was as much a civil rights challenge as anything else. And the distribution of opportunity in our country is profoundly unequal. That we had one of the most stratified education systems in the world. So one of the things that I sought to do when I was Education Secretary, as well as raising standards overall, was to close the gap between rich and poor. And quite a lot of the effort that we made with free schools, with the extension of the academies programme, and with curriculum change was to try to help the most disadvantaged children to do better. And alongside David Laws, who was a very gifted junior minister from the Liberal Democrats, we introduced something called the Pupil Premium, which meant that we targeted money more effectively on the very poorest children. And as a result, we succeeded in narrowing the gap between rich and poor, even as the gap between rich and poor widened in places like Scotland. And it's a source of, what's the word, irony to me that I grew up in the Scottish education system, which was superior to the English and which was more egalitarian because of the principle of the democratic intellect. And now we have a situation where Scotland is a more stratified society educationally and falling behind in international league tables, while England is forging ahead.
Now, David Laws said you're a combination of Jeeves and Che Guevara. So one of your latest revolutions, or your latest revolution, is Brexit, which you look at the sort of no deal proposals that are coming through. Ivan Rogers is saying that's under counted in. Did you ever realise it was going to be this complicated and this difficult and this bad when you were campaigning to leave?
I always recognised that leaving the European Union would be complicated, but the principle that a country should operate outside the structures of the European Union and succeed is not in itself a novel or a revolutionary ideal. So whether it's Norway or Switzerland or Canada or Australia, they don't have to submit themselves to the transnational rule of a body like the European Union in order to flourish. But of course, the process of leaving something that you've been a member of for 40 years is not something that you can accomplish overnight. And indeed, when I was leading the Leave campaign, I made the point that this was not something that should be rushed. I said that you should not press the Article 50 button immediately. Jeremy Corbyn said as soon as the vote came through that you should proceed with Article 50. I was on the back benches when the decision was taken to trigger Article 50. As we now know, while a great deal of good work had been put in, a proper plan for every eventuality had not been thought through. One of the reasons why I so energetically supported the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, even though I think it has its flaws, is because I believed it provided an orderly way out. I don't support no deal. I don't think that's the desired outcome. But there is a risk, as I think Ivan Rogers said earlier, that it might happen. It might be the case on October the 31st, despite our best efforts, that the EU say, sorry, you're going to have to leave. Now, I've put forward a plan which I think will command the support of people in the House of Commons and which I know people in the EU think is a potential way forward. So I think that we can ensure that we do leave in a timely and orderly way.
And how much of a delay are you willing to see? Could we still be in the EU 4 years after the referendum?
No, I think that one of the interesting things about the race is that one or two of the contenders have said that we must leave by October the 31st, come what may. And my argument is, well, if you're 85 or 95% of the way there and it just takes a little bit of extra time, would you really walk away? I don't think there's any CEO in this building who, if they were 95% towards securing a deal, would then say, oh, look, midnight's passed. Tell you what, we're walking away. My entire team, every lawyer, every accountant, every member of my negotiating team is just going to say, because we haven't concluded at midnight, that's it. Your shareholders would think, sorry, what was all that for? And I think that that would be a big mistake. I think if you're close to securing a deal, as everyone here will know, then you take the extra hours, days or weeks in order to conclude it. Otherwise, all your efforts have been set at naught.
But the civil service analysis of a no-deal Brexit is absolutely hair-raising. You know, recession, 10% rise in food prices, security risk, union at threat. Do you think Mark Sedwell is wrong, or are the hard Brexiteers wrong? Or is there a sort of roadblock to reform in Whitehall, like you talked about the blob at education?
No, I don't think that at all. I think the civil service have a responsibility, which they discharge very well, of outlining a range of scenarios. And by definition, you have to have a reasonable worst-case scenario against which to plan. If civil servants were continually giving us the sunniest and most optimistic readings of events, they wouldn't be doing their job. So I think it is right. But of course, there are a range of options which could occur in the event of no deal and a range of actions which one can take to mitigate it. But I hope I've been clear in saying that I think that no deal is not a desirable outcome. It would create economic difficulties for this country. We could get through it, but it would be much, much better not to have to go through with no deal.
And if you had to choose no deal or second referendum, which would it be?
I would choose no deal in those circumstances because I think that fundamentally the health of our democracy depends on respecting that result. And I think the British people feel a sense of exasperation. In Scots, they're scunnered at how long it's taken. But
Even if that led to a general election?
Well, I think one of the dangers here is that if the Conservative Party, this is a Conservative Party but also a national choice, if the Conservative Party were to go into a general election before Brexit had been delivered, then Jeremy Corbyn would win. And that's one of the other reasons why I worry about the way in which some have interpreted the October the 31st deadline. Because if people knew that we were making progress, and yet at the same time the Prime Minister were to say, well, I'm going to junk that and try and go for no deal, at the moment, Parliament would say, hold on a moment, you can't do that. And there'd be a vote of confidence, and general election would follow, and there is no way that a Conservative Party leader could win a general election without Brexit having been delivered.
So do you think MPs are going to change their mind if things go on longer and start backing no deal?
I think that it would be possible in certain circumstances for minds to change, depending on the position of the European Union. I certainly don't think that it can or should be ruled out, but I think that as I say, if it is the case that someone says inflexibly the only thing that will determine whether it's deal or no deal is this particular timeline, then MPs will say, well, you were making progress and you seem to have thrown that away. And I would back whoever was Prime Minister in whatever decision they took. But I think MPs would pitch us into a precipitate general election. And as I say, there is no polling evidence that any Conservative leader would win without delivering Brexit. And again, whatever people think about Brexit, whether they're enthusiastic, cautious, or whatever, it will do damage to our democracy if we don't deliver on that result. And all the evidence suggests, both in the general election and in the recent European election, that while some people have changed their minds, that broadly a clear majority of the country still wants us very firmly to leave.
Would you ever do a deal with Nigel Farage?
No, I don't think that would be a good idea.
Why not?
Well, I'm a Conservative, and Nigel is leading a different party. You know, he's achieved a great deal in politics, but his approach would be different to mine.
The thing I find a bit hard is that you're a liberal Conservative, I think. You've always been quite pro-immigration, pro-multiculturalism, but the campaign you led, the referendum, was incredibly anti-immigration. Do you now regret that? Do you feel... I interviewed a chief constable recently who said she felt that the hate crimes and the mood of politics was partly to do with the campaign that you led. Do you regret that? Do you feel ashamed of that campaign now?
No, I would disagree with that. One of the things that's striking is that since the referendum result, attitudes towards migration in Britain have changed.
But hate crimes have risen.
No, I would contest that too. Attitudes towards migration have changed. We are now the country in Europe with the most positive attitude towards migration. I remember talking to Ruth Davidson just before we were both speaking at the Scottish Conservative Party conference. And Ruth said to me, well, I'm a Remainer down to my boots. But the one thing that I do have to grant, Michael, is that your argument was right. That if people feel that they have control over migration, then their attitude towards it becomes more relaxed and liberal.
So are you proud of that campaign?
I think that there were... you could always run any campaign better. I could certainly have run aspects of past leadership campaigns better, probably, as well. The argument that we made was that our migration policy should be based not on an arbitrary target of tens of thousands, but on what was right for our economy, and that simply because someone happened to be a citizen of Bulgaria rather than Bangladesh, that shouldn't mean that they should automatically have an advantage. We should determine it on the basis of the skills we need, and also the generosity that we want to show to people fleeing persecution.
Do you think the Tories could, it would be a good idea to have another Etonian leader? Do you worry that you're still seen as the party of the rich?
Well, I don't think people worry so much about someone's background. I mean, I don't think it matters where someone went to school. I think the key thing is, what do they do in office? So I think you can come from whatever background, but if your priorities seem to be skewed towards the already fortunate in society, that's a mistake.
Are you thinking of Boris's tax proposals?
Well, I'm not thinking of any one particular candidate, but I do think that those tax proposals, are mistaken. I think that there are two tests that I would apply to any tax cut. Does it power economic growth, and does it help the most disadvantaged in our society? So I think that there are different ways in which you can change the tax burden on business, particularly small businesses, in order to boost economic growth, and you can see a multiplier effect there. But other taxes should relieve the burden on the very poorest in our society. One of the bigger problems that we have, essentially in this country, is a productivity problem. And we know, and I think Phil Collins was mentioning it earlier, that there are regional disparities in productivity. And it's a simplification, but not an oversimplification, to say that the most productive areas of our country are cities with great universities in the south and east of the country. The areas that are less productive tend to be beyond that. If we want to make our society more productive overall, we need to think about those areas. We need to, in particular, to think about an education and skills as well as infrastructure policy for those areas. And if we're thinking about the levers that government can take to make the country more productive, a tax cut which concentrates on helping the wealthiest pensioners most of all is not a tax cut which either improves productivity or generates a greater level of social equity.
So you said in 2016 that you thought Boris Johnson was basically incapable of being Prime Minister. Have you changed your mind?
Well, yes. I think that we have 10, if you include myself, good candidates, and I think that all of them need to be scrutinised on the basis of the policies that they're putting forward, not anything that happened in the past. This is the 2019 leadership election.
But do you think he has the attention to detail, the grip, the focus, the discipline, and the judgment?
We'll find out during this race.
Right.
All the candidates will be subjected to scrutiny, and as I say, Boris was a great mayor of London. It was enjoyable working with him as Foreign Secretary. He now has the opportunity to set out his stall and to be judged, as all the candidates will be, on the basis of their ideas and policies.
And how much is character a factor, do you think, in politics and leadership, whether in business or in politics? Do you think character matters as much as policy?
I think that I know where you're going with this question. I think that there are essentially, as Doris Kearns-Goodwin pointed out in her book about Abraham Lincoln, the best administrations have different types of characters in them. Theresa is a different character from David Cameron, but they've both been dedicated, selfless, and good prime ministers. So it all depends. We all have strengths in one area and weaknesses in another. You just need to look at the mix overall.
And how much do you think the drugs thing is a factor? Have you been surprised by the backlash? I mean, John McDonnell this morning said he couldn't afford to take, working class boy, couldn't afford to take Class A drugs. But actually, you didn't have a very privileged background either.
No.
And I just wondered why you had taken drugs.
Well, one of the things that I wrote about in the Times article at the time was that just because someone has made a mistake, that doesn't mean that if they've fallen from high standards, that doesn't mean that you should then lower the standards. All of us will have principles by which we will seek to live our life, and all of us will occasionally fall short of them. But that doesn't mean that the principle was wrong. It just meant that you succumbed, as we all do from time, to human frailty. And so some have said, well, if you've done this, then you should be advocating this liberalisation or this deregulation or whatever. There's a good argument out there about the different ways in which we should approach this issue, but I think it should be separated from what any one individual has done. The argument should be made on the basis of the quality of the idea. And one of the other things that I would say is that a knowledge of human frailty went with me into office, but was when I was, as you know, when I was Justice Secretary, one of the things I was very, very anxious to do was never to judge any prisoner on or to fine them by their worst moment. I was always anxious to see how we could help them lead better lives in the future.
So why do you think you succumbed to human frailty in that situation?
I think we are all sinners in a fallen world.
Was it a sense that you wanted to be part of a gilded elite that you hadn't grown up in, do you think?
No, I don't think so, no. No, I felt, to be fair, I actually feel very privileged of my background, because as you know, I was adopted, and I was given the most precious gift that any child can have, which is the unconditional love of their parents.
I just wonder whether voters care about what politicians do in their private lives. Do you think they care as much or less than MPs and party members, or do you think it's irrelevant in the end?
I don't know. I mean, I think everything comes together. So I think that people will make a judgment in the round. As I say, if you look at past prime ministers and past politicians, as they say at the end of Some Like It Hot, when the millionaire proposes to one of the characters, who of course is a man dressed as a woman, and the character reveals that she's a man, and the millionaire says, well, nobody's perfect. One of the things that I would say is that people will make a judgment overall. And ultimately, we're choosing a political leader. And my argument is that I've shown in office as a politician in 3 different government departments that I can deliver. And I'm showing now a range of ideas and an analysis of what we need to do to make Britain better, which I hope people will think is right, and people will then make their own judgment.
Do you think there are issues about Boris Johnson's private life, different issues?
No. I think that Boris and all the other candidates should be judged solely on the ideas they put forward and their willingness to enter into this debate.
And do you think he's now an election winner? Because that's the sort of myth in the Tory party, that he's the most electorally sensible choice. But actually, I just have this sense he's gone from being the Heineken candidate to the Marmite candidate, and that Remainers would find it very hard to vote for him now. What do you think about that?
Well, funnily enough, on a personal level, I like Marmite more than Heineken. But, again, you know, a judgment will be made. And I think the most important thing is you can make a judgment about someone's electability, and you can say X or Y appears to be doing better. But we know that actually, if someone is Prime Minister, the British people look afresh at anyone who becomes Prime Minister. So Gordon Brown, many people would have said, oh, he's, you know, doer technocrat. He becomes Prime Minister, people think, actually, do you know what? He's rather capable. Then, of course, with the botched election, that moment goes. In the same way, Theresa, people would have said, I'm not sure Theresa has, you know, the glamour, terrible word, of some other candidates, but Theresa was a very effective Prime Minister, big lead, and then things went wrong in the general election. The British people are fair-minded. They give any Prime Minister a chance to prove themselves. And ultimately, if a Prime Minister in office displays the grip, the competence, the vision, and has the right policies, then he or she will be elected and re-elected.
But do you think Boris Johnson is the most likely to win an election?
Well, I've just been watching, I watched last night the latest in a series about a former Prime Minister, and she was a former Education Secretary. People said that she was a divisive figure, and that she was too interested in ideas and didn't have the touchy-feely requirements that you need to win in politics. And it appears that Margaret Thatcher wasn't fazed by that, and that she won general elections in 79, 83, and 87. So I think what is sometimes deemed electability is a more complex quality than people often allow.
So do you model yourself more on Margaret Thatcher now than Martin Luther King?
I have enormous respect for Margaret Thatcher, but the person actually, funnily enough, my political hero is Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay. And he had a sort of war on the robber barons, if you like. Do
Yes.
you worry that, do you agree with them, Boris Johnson, about four-letter words on business and that capitalism has sort of gone wrong?
No, I wasn't there when that remark was allegedly said, so I can't imagine that anyone would say that, because as I said in the Sunday Telegraph, sorry, apologies that it was the Telegraph, business is a force for good. Nearly all the things that make our lives better, from the drugs that alleviate pain to the entertainment that brings families together, is generated by business. My father was a small businessman. Enterprise is what drives our country and the world forward. So I'm emphatically pro-business and enterprise, but I do think that we do need to look at some aspects of capitalism, because Teddy Roosevelt, and for that matter, FDR in the 1930s recognized that you sometimes need to reform capitalism in order to save it. And I think that there are some things that we need to do, for example, to look at lobbying, to look at corporate governance, and in particular to look at competition policy in order to make sure that Britain continues to be, as it has been in the past, not just the home of great established companies who generate such wealth and opportunity, but also the home of the new disruptors who are going to provide wealth and opportunity in the future.
I want to take a couple of questions in a minute, but just finally, are you going to stay in this race? People are saying, you know, you may have been damaged. Are you going to stay in? And if so, why? And I feel that you're very keen to prove that from your background you can succeed, and sort of prove to your parents that you can do it. Is that why? Is that what's motivating you? Or what?
No. I owe an enormous amount to my parents, and I would always want them to feel that the chance they took on me in adopting me was the right decision. But no, the reason I'm in it is that I've seen what being Prime Minister takes. I know that it is a daunting challenge, but I've worked with 2 different Prime Ministers in 3 different serious roles. I believe that I have the experience to be able to deliver. I also believe that, having argued strongly for Brexit, but having worked in government with people who were passionately in favour of Remain, I can bring people together. So I think that I'm ready to deliver, ready to unite, ready to lead.
And you're not going to give up?
No.
Okay, great. Are there any questions for Michael Gove from the floor? Or maybe not? Yes, over there.
What makes you think that there are What makes you think the majority of the country still want to leave? Where do you get that data from?
I think almost all the polling evidence, and certainly the recent elections, suggest that that is so. Now, of course, it may be the case, it has been the case, that there are some people, Nick Ferrari, who said, I voted leave and now I would vote remain. But it is also the case that there are a significant number of people who voted remain, who say, we must get on with this decision and we must honour that democratic result. And I think the fact that at the time we said, this is your decision and we will implement it, was the right one. Paddy Ashdown said on the night of the referendum, you know, democracy is a precious thing. If the British people give you an instruction, you should deliver it. I won't have any time for anyone who says that we should overturn it. So I think that, you know, there's a clear mandate and a responsibility on people who represent seats that voted leave and who themselves voted to trigger Article 50 to see that through.
Don't you worry about the generational divide, though, that 80% of younger people don't want to leave, and the longer it goes on, the more of those people are going to turn 18?
I think that it is certainly the case that there was a generational, what's the word, preponderance.
Divide. Split.
I don't believe in creating division. Preponderance one way, but I think that it's also the case that there were very many young people who were passionately in favour of leaving. And I think also, one of the things I would say
Not
is...
the majority, though.
I would say that a lot depends on how we leave. So I'll take one particular area, the area for which I'm directly responsible. No one I've met defends the Common Agricultural Policy. No one. Even George Monbiot says that the best thing about leaving the European Union was being out of the CAP, and if it was just on the CAP alone, he would be a Brexiteer. The Common Agricultural Policy is a system of rewarding the already wealthy by saying, whatever the size of your land holding, we'll give you money on that basis, and it works against environmental enhancement. And the approach that I've taken to reforming the Common Agricultural Policy has been endorsed by organisations from Friends of the Earth to Greenpeace, not in every area, but broadly as a direction of travel, whom one would not naturally think were either in favour of leaving the European Union or in favour of a Conservative minister. But the approach I've taken is this is an opportunity in an area where the EU had been regressive to be progressive. And I think that the good thing about democratic accountability, and I believe Brexit creates increased democratic accountability, is that future generations can choose to take a more radical or more progressive course for Britain if they think that is right.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. This gentleman at the back there.
Thank you. My name is Paul Adamson. Mr. Gove, you said a number of times that if progress is made to the tune of 80–90% by the end of October, it'd be crazy to walk away from those negotiations.
Yes.
Could you give us an idea what the 80–90% of progress actually means in reality?
Yes, I think what it would mean would be two particular things, though there are some smaller things as well. The first is agreement on changes to the political declaration. At the moment, the political declaration has been kept deliberately quite vague, and I think that we can be rather more precise about the future economic relationship. And I think the other thing as well is work on alternative arrangements on the Northern Ireland border. I think it is right that there are some specific challenges that need to be resolved. I don't think the backstop is the best way of resolving them, and indeed both the EU and the Irish Republic have stressed that the backstop is an insurance policy which is never meant to be permanent. So what we need to do to give confidence is to show that the way in which the backstop can be superseded, or indeed never entered into, is being pursued energetically, and people can have confidence on both sides of the Irish border and in the UK and in the EU that serious action is being taken. And the conversations I've had reinforce in my view that the EU completely understands the need for progress to be demonstrated in that area.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michael and Rachel, thank you very much. I was particularly pleased to see Michael's characteristically polite treatment of his opponents, although I did think the line, "We should judge Boris Johnson by the quality of his ideas," was a brutal denunciation. We're going to move now from politics to technology, and then we're going to end with a politician who turned to technology. The word unicorn in politics has acquired a very pejorative meaning.